Hello. Over the years, many of you have asked me to do a video on all of the different English accents that crop up throughout the land. And so far, I've put it off because I'm lazy and it takes a lot of research. But finally, I was convinced to do it by my good friend Gloria from Fort Wayne, Indiana, who is directing Peter and the Starcatcher at the Arena Dinner Theatre there. And so this video is jointly for the cast and crew of that show and my subscriber base. So it's kind of a win-win for everybody, except maybe the people that are from the places where these accents originated, because you know how those videos go. But what I'm going to do is just sort of a very general overview. They will be generalized, you know, within each of them. You can find nuances that differ from what I'm going to teach or say. They're just sort of general observations. But let's get to our first accent. It's probably the one known most by people from outside of the UK, and that is RP, received pronunciation. It's the way the Queen speaks. That's it, received pronunciation. Not only is it the way the Queen speaks, it's also the way that every broadcaster from the past used to speak. I should say, as we're going through each accent, I've concocted a kind of a poem, right, that kind of includes most of the vowel sounds, because I think the vowel sounds are kind of key to picking up the accent, along with a bit of rhythm and all of that. And that poem is as follows, and it's no Wordsworth. But that's not the point. The point is just to pick up the vowels. And the poem goes, Peter and Wendy was a book by Barry, so reference to Peter Pan. Only a fool would say it was not. I now enjoy it more than I should. Perhaps thus far I ought to stop. So those are the words we're going to go with, and I'll take it slowly for each accent. The first one, of course, RP. So let's say that I'm the Queen or those broadcasters from the past, and I've received this poem by Lawrence M. Brown, to make me sound more poetic. I would read it possibly thus. Peter and Wendy was a book by Barry. Notice that I roll the R's there. They tend to do that. Only a fool would say it was not. I now enjoy it more than I should. Perhaps thus far I ought to stop. So I think, you know, you can play back what I just said again and again to kind of pick up on those received pronunciation sounds. That's the upper class. That's the posh way of speaking. So if you are on stage and you're playing an upper class character, this is possibly the kind of accent you would adopt. But so to listen to, you know, contemporary examples of this way of speaking, you might want to look at Dame Judi Dench or Maggie Smith, you know, in Downton Abbey. It's very upper crust. I think what I would say about this is everything's deliberate. Don't be afraid to over-enunciate it. I think at times when you're doing an accent, you almost don't want to over-enunciate it on stage because it might not sound natural. But you have to remember there are audience members that really clearly have to hear you. Of course, not only do you have to enunciate, but you have to project. And of course you can do that with any accent. It doesn't matter what you do, and if I'm not careful, I will go into Sir Ian McKellen, who is another fine example of how to do that. So the last one was sort of an upper crust way of speaking, but this gets us more regional, right? It gets us to that part of London where they sort of speak like Dick Van Dyke wanted to speak and never quite managed it. So Dick Van Dyke from Mary Poppins, he's widely ridiculed in the UK for doing a bad example. I say ridiculed, I think he's lovingly ridiculed. We kind of like Dick Van Dyke, we like Bert, the character in Mary Poppins. But he sort of famously got the accent sort of bang wrong. It was a weird merger of like his American accent and what he sort of perceived to be Cockney. So I would say if you're aiming for this accent, you know, do better than him, and you're already doing something right. A decent example to look to might be Michael Caine. If we're talking about Michael Caine, right, he does the opposite in many ways of enunciate. If you're to watch Michael Caine on the stage, he wouldn't quite enunciate in the way as you'd like. You know. So I think what I would do, we'll go ahead and read my majestic poem again, why not? So it'd be more along the lines of this. Peter and Wendy was a book by Barry. Only a fool would say it was not. with that last line, whereas RP would very much be along the lines of I ought to stop. People with a Cockney accent are going to be saying it I ought. It's a weird sound in many ways. They always put a W in there. I ought. Feel free to pause the video at this point, but if you are brave and you want to go on, we're going to head up into the northwest of England now to a little city called Liverpool. So famously, Liverpool is the city of the Beatles, and it's also a city that practices the Scouse dialect or accent. And in terms of the accental features of Scouse, it's weird because the Beatles speak what you might class as a kind of refined version of Scouse. So when you think of Ringo Starr, you know, he's not exactly what you think of these days as your typical Scouser. You're thinking more of Steven Gerrard, the footballer, or Wayne Rooney, his counterpart. A lot of American people have told me it's a hard accent to understand. It almost sounds like it's not English at all, you know. It's hard to understand at times, but I think if you concentrate on the vowel sounds, you might be able to get it down. In terms of consonants, they're also a big part of it. It's the way they pronounce their D's and the T's. You got to listen out for that. Well, if we were to read the poem, it'd be Peter and Wendy was a book by Barry. Only a fool would say it was not. Perhaps thus far I should stop. And sticking in the north of England, it's a part of England actually I'm close to being from. A lot of people mistake me for some reason for being from this county, but it's the largest county in England. It is Yorkshire. And because it's the largest county in England, of course, there's quite a lot of variations, very nuanced variations in the way people speak in this part of the world. But it is quite a prevalent, accental feature of England. It is also, if you've ever seen Downton Abbey, which was referenced earlier on, a lot of the sort of underclass characters, the ones that work in the kitchens and, you know, the maids and all of that, they kind of have that Yorkshire accent because I think it's sort of set in Yorkshire. And, you know, that's an accent that, it's one of my favourite accents. It's also the accent, at least the sort of localised Huddersfield version of it, of the Next Doctor, Jodie Whittaker. And, you know, I think it's sort of an interesting one to try and pick up. I think if I were to give you an example of somebody that I think of when I think of like the Yorkshire accent, just in a general sense, right? It's Brian Glover, former wrestler, but also actor. He had a bit part role in American Werewolf in London when the two Americans turn up at that pub right at the beginning. He's that sort of like snarky bald man. They speak a little like that. There's a dropping of different sounds, and sometimes I think it's easier to do a Yorkshire accent when you go deep. Going deep really helps with it. I don't know why. It's partially to do with that Brian Glover effect. It's also to do with Brian Clough, which is a similar name to Brian Glover. Brian Clough was manager of Nottingham Forest and Derby, you know, back in the day. And he was a proper Yorkshireman, and people loved him for it, even though he was a bit snarky. You know, so if you listen to this, there's a lot of interesting usages of the vowel sounds. You know, we extend a lot of A's. That's A. But, you know, if we were to read the poem again, it would be along these lines in the most general of senses. Peter and Wendy was a book by Barry. Only a fool would say it was not. I now enjoy it more than I should. Perhaps, thus far, I ought to stop. That's all for this episode. Cheerio. Bye. See ya.